Hello, historians. It's Mrs. Jones back again with some of Chapter 23's key takeaways. For a bit of a review, we had talked earlier about the belief systems, the Reformations, the Protestant Reformation, Catholic Reformation, and eventually into that of the 30 Years' War and how Europe survived those particular events. Now let's look more into the developments in government and also in science. Okay, here we go. I have three sources that I'm working through, so guys, bear with me. All right, so as in every era that we have studied, emperors and kings have sought to strengthen their power through religion, laws, military force, and economic policies. And that doesn't change for circa 1450 to 1750, the era in which we are looking at. So, first, let's take a look at Russia. All right, Russia was explained in the chapter just only briefly. I want to highlight over a couple of things. Russia was the great land empire of that of Asia. We'll talk more about the Ottoman and Mughal Empire that were significant regions, but they were no match for Russia. All right, Russia's entry into the world affairs began with Ivan the Great, who ran off the last of the Mongol rulers in the late 15th century. And then from that point on, Russian leaders had expanded their territories through conquest, first to the east and then into the south and into the west. The largest area was that of the east, which was across the Siberia. In the 16th century, Ivan the Terrible began a conquest of Siberia that continued for about 100 years. And then from the late 17th century through that of the late 18th century, Peter the Great and Catherine the Great added territories north of the Black and Caspian Seas. Russian migrants flooded into these areas, greatly changing the cultural makeup of these particular regions. Now, I'm going to do a little comparison and contrasting of some empires that we have talked about in the past and some that will emerge again in the next two chapters that we're going to read. All right, so like that of China, the Russian Empire ended the era of nomadic people. It insisted on farming instead of pastoralism. All right, like the Chinese in Mongolia and also in Central Asia, and the Spanish and Portuguese in Latin America, Russian imposed requirements for local peasants to build roads and to perform other public works projects. So they utilized the peasantry class and merged them more into a serfdom type of working relationship. And they had them do all the hard labor in order to prosper the particular empire. Like that of China, but unlike that of Latin America, Russia generally maintained a policy of religious toleration in the regions that they conquered. Now, they don't talk much about religious toleration, but Russia maintained that. All right, let's talk about the Tsar, Peter the Great, and Catherine the Great. Not only expanded Russia's empire's land holdings, but they also actively sought to make Russia a modern, quote unquote, nation along the lines of those in Western Europe at that time. They were moderately successful on some fronts. All right, first of all, Peter built a new capital city, St. Petersburg. So humble of him to give it that name, which was modeled after the capitals of Western Europe. Peter and Catherine modernized the military, and like the Qin dynasty, which we will get into on the next chapter, and other Chinese dynasties, invited foreign experts to advise the royal court. Catherine famously proclaimed Russia to be a European nation. This settled, at least for some Russian foreign policy, the question of which direction the government would make a priority, Asia or Europe. Russia's empire occupied both and, in fact, was mostly in Asia. Catherine also invited foreigners to settle Russia and offered incentives for them to do so. Thousands of immigrants, especially from Central Europe, took advantage of her offer. This policy was similar to the United States granting tracts of land in the Midwest in the 19th centuries. Even after decades of westernization by Peter and Catherine, two major institutions carried over unchanged into the 19th century into Russia: serfdom and absolute monarchy. Neither leader ended serfdom, although Western Europe had done so in the 15th century, nor did they take steps to limit the Tsar's authority by allowing a constitution or by granting power to their parliament, as England had done. All right, which leads me into our next section dealing with absolute monarchies. Now, as you read, absolute monarchies and also a constitutional monarchy in Europe had began. Now, when we talk about absolutism, it's still on a theoretical foundation known as the divine right of kings. This theory held that kings derived their authority from God and served as God's lieutenants upon earth. There was no role in divine right theory for common subjects or even nobles in public affairs. The king made law and determined policy. Noncompliance or disobedience merited punishment, and rebellion was a despicable act tantamount to blasphemy. So when we talk about absolute monarchs, King Louis XIV basically was the absolute monarch of his particular time. While I did a little research on Louis XIV, surprisingly, he grew up alone. He was brought up by servants. He had almost drowned in a pond because no one, bless his little heart, was watching him. Wars broke out based on this absolute monarchy in his earlier age. And then he grew up seeing famine and poverty, which kind of changed his whole view plan of what an absolute monarch needed to be. And so he's known from our reading as the Sun King. In French, he called himself the state. He said, "L'état, c'est moi." The state is mine. And so basically he ruled from his palace. His whole court needed to live near him, and the massive palace of Versailles, which you guys will get an opportunity to tour this upcoming week, and how fascinating the building was. He created his army, and he had an entourage of following, and that was the way that he kept his power. He kept all of his noblemen close to him. All right. So with that being said, other major powers in Europe besides Russia, France, and Spain were under absolute monarchies during this era. In an absolute monarchy, I'm going to repeat myself just a little bit. All of the government's power resides in one ruler. It was said that the king was above the law, and that is, the law did not necessarily apply to the king. Each king had advisors and a parliament, but all served at the monarch's pleasure. England's system was a major exception to this trend. In 1689, its parliament firmly established a constitutional monarchy during the Glorious Revolution. Under that system, the monarch operated under the law and in tandem with the parliament. England's style of constitutional monarchy eventually became the style of government all European kings would soon accept. All right, I'm looking at my time. Oh, heavens, I'm 9 minutes in. All right, so let's move and switch gears to the birth of the scientific revolution. All right, I'm going to go over a couple of things about the birth of modern science. Here we go. Since the Renaissance, European scientists had been accumulating and they had been refining scientific and mathematical data, garnered along trade routes through interactions with Muslims and Chinese scholars. The monarchs of European nations in the 15th through the 17th century, Spain, Portugal, England, and France, had sponsored men and women who had conducted scientific research with the hope that new technology might give their country a competitive edge in the world market. The scientific revolution long-term effects on Western society was to reduce the people's faith in divine explanations of life mysteries. The Christian church, still had millions of followers, but Westerners began to look to and depend more on science for answers to society's challenge. All right, here we go. 10 minutes. Okay, here I go. All right. So, a new way of thinking. The particular people that were the makers of the European scientific revolution were intellectual. They culturally transformed the area in which they lived in, mainly during the mid 16th and early 18th century. These men, and I did say men, of science would no longer rely on the external authority of the Bible, the church, or speculations of ancient philosophers, or the received wisdom of cultural tradition. For them, knowledge would be acquired through a combination of careful observation, controlled experiments, and the formulation of general laws expressed in mathematical terms. Those that had started or created this revolution, Copernicus from Poland, Galileo from Italy, Descartes from France, and Newton from England, and many others, they saw themselves as departing radically from the older ways of thinking. All right, so the scientific revolution, it fundamentally altered ideas about the place of humankind within the cosmos and sharply challenged both the teachings and the authority of the church, which was a big no-no. All right. When applied to the affairs of the human society, scientific ways of thinking challenged ancient social hierarchies and political systems, and they played a role in the revolutionary upheavals of the modern era. But science also legitimized racial and gender inequalities, giving new support to old ideas about the natural inferiority of women, oh heavens, and that of enslaved people. All right, I still got time. I got to hurry though. Here's the question. What was revolutionary about the scientific revolution? Well, the scientific revolution was revolutionary because it put an end to the idea that the earth was stationary and at the center of the universe, which had been the dominant view of the world in Western Europe. It was also revolutionary because the laws formulated by Isaac Newton showed that the universe was not propelled by angels and spirits, but functioned on its own according to timeless principles that could be described mathematically. A corollary of this view was the idea that the knowledge of the universe could be obtained through human reason alone, without the aid of ancient authorities or divine revelation. But above all, it was revolutionary because it challenged educated people to question traditional views of the world and humankind's place in it, culminating into the Enlightenment. All right. Now, I was quick on that. I wanted to give you a little bit more. I wanted to go a little bit more in depth with Ptolemy. He lived during Alexandria, and basically he thought that the earth was stationary and the center of the universe, which tied into that of the Catholic Church, like I had mentioned before. Then Copernicus came along, and he said, hey, no. His argument was at the middle of things lies the sun, and that the earth, like the other planets, revolved around it. Thus, the earth was no longer unique or at the obvious center of God's attention. Okay, 13 minutes, 30 seconds. Here we go. Some notable participants. All right. We talked about Copernicus, Francis Bacon. Don't that remind you of breakfast? He emphasized observation and experimentation as the key to modern science. Galileo developed an improved telescope. He discovered sunspots, mountains on the moon, Jupiter's moons, performed experimental works on the velocity of falling objects. Johann Kepler, planets follow elliptical, not circular orbits, describe the laws of planetary motion. René Descartes emphasized the importance of mathematics and logical deduction in understanding the physical world and invented analytical geometry. I know that's your favorite. And then lastly, Isaac Newton synthesized earlier findings around the concept of universal gravitation, invented calculus, and formulated the concept of inertia and the laws of motion. Folks, I got 30 seconds before my time runs out, and I'm not creating another video. Just know that women were not involved in the scientific revolution as they would like to have. They followed behind their husbands, sometimes their fathers and their brothers, but males took the lead. Thanks for listening. Toodle pip.